Kol davar shaya bichlal v'yatsa min haklal lo lamed lo lamed al atzmo yatsa elo lamed al kol kula yatsa. This is Midah number 8 in the list of the 13. And you'll remember that if something was included in a generalization, but then the Torah singles it out, so the halacha is that whatever the singling out is teaching me, and that we don't always know yet, it is not just teaching me about the thing that was singled out, but it teaches me about the whole general category from which the thing that was singled out was singled out. So again, without examples, it's impossible to make sense of this. So let me just quickly chazer. We gave 3 examples of how this midah works. The first was the din of mechashefa, which we will just assume is a practitioner of magic, kishuf. The generalization is every practitioner, kol machashefa lo sechaya, every practitioner of magic gets the death penalty. That's the klal. And that includes magic such as ohr and yidoni, which is specific magic. Then we have, it was something taken out of the klal, and that is ohr and yidoni gets skila. It tells you what the death penalty is. So it's a davar that was in the klal. It was then separated from the klal to give me a death penalty of specific content, skila. So what do I say? It is not only teaching me about ohr and yidoni, it's teaching me about the whole klal of machashefa, that all types of magic will have skila, and that is the meaning of the death penalty, lo sechaya. Now, that case is actually the easiest of the 3 cases, because there you absolutely know what it's teaching me. Yatsa min haklal, it was taken out of the klal, lelame, to teach me. What does it teach me? It's obvious what it teaches me. It teaches me that the death penalty is skila, which I don't know from the klal, because the klal just says lo sechaya. Lo sechaya could mean any death penalty. Yatsa min haklal lelame. Now, the other 2 examples are a bit more difficult, because you don't automatically know what it's coming to teach you. It's coming to teach you something, but that itself requires Chazal to be machriya. What is it coming to teach you? Meaning you don't have an obvious thing that is coming to teach you. The second example was havara. Havara means starting a fire or igniting a fire. And the klal is laisase kol malacha, right? You're not allowed to do malacha on Shabbos, and that refers to the 39 categories of work, and we know that fire is one of those categories. It's a klal. The klal includes havara, and yet there's a separate negative commandment, lo sevaru esh, in Parshas Vayakel. Do not make a fire. So once again, it's yatsa min haklal. It was included in the klal, but then the Torah mentions it separately. So whatever it's coming to teach me will be on the whole klal. Now here, though, I just want to point out, maybe it's a minor point, I just want to point out that here you don't automatically know what it's coming to teach you. Because all it's telling me is you're not allowed to make a fire, and I knew that from the klal, meaning unlike the first example, where I knew what ohr and yidoni was teaching me that I didn't know before that, skila, here, all I'm doing is, the Torah says it's usher to do 39 malachos, and I have a pasuk that says it's usher to do this malacha. So before you could say it goes back on the klal, you have to know what it's coming to teach you. In other words, yatsa min haklal, it was separated from the klal to teach me something. So whatever it is that it's teaching me is going back on the whole klal. But here you have to define what is it teaching me. You see, it's not as self-evident as the first example. So you'll remember, it does teach me the principle of lechalek, and I don't want to repeat everything, but lechalek basically means that if I did 38 malachas plus fire, I would bring a separate chatas for fire because it's a separate aveira. But once the Torah teaches me havara is a separate aveira, it's megala that all 39 malachos of Shabbos are separate Averos, with the result that if I did 39 malachos on Shabbos, b'shogeg, inadvertently, I would have to bring 39 chatois. Masha ein kain, if I did the same malacha 100 times, I was kotzer, I would only bring one chatas, because the general rule is, doing the same aveira over and over again, you only bring one chatas. Different aveiros, you bring different chatois. And lechalek is teaching me a chiddush that every malacha is regarded as a separate aveira, even though most of them are only one lav. Meaning, if I would ask you, what lav do I transgress when I write on Shabbos? There's no lav that says, thou shalt not write. There's no lav. There's a lav that says, don't do malacha. So if I write and I harvest, when I wrote, I was over on leisasek hamalacha. And when I harvested, I was over on leisasek hamalacha. So you could have had a very logical havamina, that what's the difference if I write and harvest or I write and write? If I write and write, I'm only chayav one chatas. And if I write and harvest, I should be chayav one chatas too. So that's the chiddush of lechalek that we learn from Havara. Because Havara is a separate lav. So for sure you'll be chayav a separate one for that. It's megala that the whole klal is, that we regard, in other words, essentially we regard every malacha of Shabbos as a separate maisa aveira, even though 38 of them are subsumed under one lav. Yeah.
So just going back to the first example of
witchcraft. Yeah.
Ohr and Yidoni are different things, yeah?
Yeah, ohr and Yidoni are two types. Yeah.
Can't you learn that principle from only using one example and saying if you get skill out from ohr?
Oh, so in other words, why does the Torah give two examples? That is a good question. What is the need for two examples? Any yitzia min haklal will be megala on the entire klal. That's a good question. I don't know. I'll think about it and see. So I'm sure the Meforshim ask it, but I don't remember what they say, or if they do ask it, but Ms. Tama they do. I'll try to check it out. But it's a good kasha. Okay, the third example is similar to the second example, that you don't automatically know what it's teaching me, and that is, there is a general rule. Again, forgive me for chazering, but I think a little chazara on these inyanim are helpful, especially since I'm then going to give you a new klal, which kind of contradicts this klal. So you need to know this klal to now know the contradiction to this klal. And that is, the Torah gives a klal, anybody who eats kodesh, holy things, when they are tameh, are chayav kares. The Torah then says, anybody who eats a korban shulamim, if they are tameh, are chayav kares. So, shulamim was in the klal. Shulamim is holy, shulamim is kodesh. So, why does the Torah give me a new pasuk about shulamim? Answer, it's coming to teach me something. Now, here, okay, it's coming, but what is it teaching me? I mean, right? It's not teaching me anything directly, because if all it's telling me is, if I eat shlamim betuma, I'm chayav kares, I know that already. The answer is, it's coming to teach me what type of, in other words, this is interesting, this is only teaching me about the klal, meaning, see, in all the other cases, I was learning something about the prat that I didn't know. In other words, in the case of what was the first one? In the case of Shabbos, I'm learning Havara is a separate lav. I didn't know that. In the case of ohr v'yidoni, I'm learning their skila. I didn't know that. Here, I'm actually learning nothing about shlamim that I didn't know. What am I learning about shlamim? That I'm chayav kares if I'm tameh? I knew that already. So this is actually an interesting example that the only thing shlamim is teaching me is about the klal. Not that it's teaching me in the prat and then I apply it to the klal. It's only teaching me to the klal. And what is it teaching me? That when it says kodesh is chayav kares, it is only a kodesh that is comparable to shlamim, and that is something that was sanctified for the mizbeach, a korban, in other words. It doesn't have to be a shlamim. It could be a chatas, an ola, whatever it is, as opposed to that which is sanctified for bedek habayis. But you understand, the third one is a little different, because there is nothing it's teaching me about shlamim that I didn't know. It's only teaching me about the klal. Okay, so it is a little different than the other ones. Okay, so that is principle number 8. And what you need to be aware of in principle number 8 is the Gemara almost never tells you when it is using that principle. It just does it in a brisa, but it doesn't alert you that that is what is being done. In other words, it'll interpret psukim and say things, and what it's doing is exactly that, even though those words are not going to appear. See, kal v'chomer, gezei reshava, usually the Gemara will tell you when they're doing that. Binyanav, mamatzinu, the Gemara will tell you. When it does this, it almost never tells you. But it does this all the time. And once if you understand this principle, you will see it in the way a brisa is analyzing a pasuk. Okay. So we now come, I'm going to skip over 2 principles, which are super obscure, and I'm going to just deal with regular obscure. So I'm going to skip to number 11, right? So 8, 9, 10 for now, I'm going to skip. Let's go to 11. Starts off with the same words. Kol davar shahaya bichlal. Something was in a klal. V'yatsa lidain b'davar hachadash. And it is separated to teach me a new thing. So here we are told, I ata yachol hachziro lichlalo. You cannot return it back to the klal, unless yachzirenu hakasib beferes. Unless the Torah itself tells you it goes back. So just looking at 8 and looking at 11, we see that these klalim are dealing with the same situation of something that was in a klal and then separated out. But under number 8, whatever the separation is teaching me goes back on the klal. Right, those were our examples. Under number 11, whatever it's coming to teach me does not go back on the klal. And the question is, when do you apply 8? When do I say the singling out goes back on the klal? That's number 8. And when do I say number 8? When do I say that the singling out does not go back on the klal, which is number 11? Right? You cannot return it to the klal. So let me give you an example here. Let's first give an example, then we'll try to see when do you apply 8, when do you apply 11. They're opposite rules. They are opposite statements. And again, the problem with these examples is these examples presuppose a lot of knowledge. In other words, they're complicated areas of the Torah in and of itself. So to understand the example, you have to have the background knowledge. When a person is a mitzayra, well, okay, let me start this way. There is a korban in the Torah called an asham, a korban asham. Asham in English is translated as a guilt offering. And just for your own knowledge, an asham, which is called a guilt offering, is not the same as a chatas, which is called a sin offering. Both of them are brought for averos, b'shogeg, but they are brought for different types of averos. A chatas is brought for an avera for which, if you did it b'mezid, you would be chayav kares, death by heaven, or misa if you were warned. Right? So anything that b'mezid you're chayav kares or higher, b'shogeg you're chayav v'chatas. Example, actually there are 36 examples. There's a whole Maseches Krisos that deals with this, but the example would be Chilul Shabbos, as we talked about, eating chametz on Pesach, eating or doing malacha on Yom Kippur. Right? These are things that you're chayav kares. If I do it b'mezid, b'shogeg I bring a chatas. An asham is for a miscellany of various other averas. For example, if a person made a false oath, a false shavua, denying money, right, to the korban asham. If you're mayol behektish, if you get benefit not eating betuma. See, if you eat betuma, you actually bring a chatas, because that's a chiyuv kares. But let's say you didn't eat the korban, you simply rode it, right? Someone was makdish a cow, and you rode it, or whatever it would be. So that's called me'ila. Me'ila is getting benefit from sanctified things, so you bring a osham. And by the way, that's true for whether it's bedek habayis or mizbeach. Right, that actually is the same for both. Okay? Now, so number one difference between a chatas and an asham is chatas is for one type of sin, asham is for another type of sin. The second difference is that the avodah is different. I mean, that's why they're called different names. By a korban chatas, the zerikas hadam, the sprinkling of the blood, is the Kohen applies, he dips his finger in the blood, and he applies it to the four corners of the Mizbeach. Every corner of the Mizbeach, there is what's called a matan dam, as opposed to a korban asham, where the zerikas hadam is simply throwing it on the base of the altar. So this is called shtei matanos, 2 applications that turn into 4. What does that mean? The Mizbeach is square. So the Kohen stands at the base of the Mizbeach at one corner, at the corner where the 2 sides meet. He throws the blood from a bowl, so some of it goes here, and then diagonally he stands on that side and throws the blood, so it goes here and here. So he threw the blood twice, but there is blood on all 4 corners of the Mizbeach. That's what is called shtei matanot, 2 applications, shehein arba, which wind up to be 4 applications, right? Here, diagonal there, so this wall, this wall, this wall, this wall, and it's at the base of the Mizbeach, not on top, not the corners on top of the Mizbeach. Different avodah. The common denominator is that the internal fats and organs are sacrificed on the Mizbeach, and the Kohen eats the meat. So that's the same, but the zerikas hadam is different. Now again, as I say, if you're not used to kachim, you might think these are small differences. These are not small differences. The inyan of zerikas hadam is the single most important component of every korban, and the laws of zerikas hadam have to be meticulously observed, or the korban is legamri pasol. So whether it's matan damim on top of the Mizbeach with the one's finger, or whether it's zerikas damim on the base of the Mizbeach, shtei matana shehein arba, is not a matter of inconsequential importance. It is what defines the korban. Okay, so in Parshas Tzav, the Torah tells me exactly how to bring a korban asham. It talks about the way the blood is sprinkled and the way the fats and organs are burnt on the Mizbeach and the way the meat is eaten by the Kohanim. All of that is in Parshas Tzav, and that includes every asham. Now, one of the people who brings a korban asham is the Mitzayra. A person after Tzaras goes away, brings a number of korbanos, and one of them is called the asham of a mitzorah. But the asham of a mitzorah has a unique mitzvah that no other asham has, and that is matan bahonos. That means in addition to the sprinkling of the blood, which is shtei matanot shehein arba, the Kohen takes a certain amount of blood and he applies it to the earlobe, the right earlobe of the mitzorah, the right thumb, and the right toe. When I say right, I don't mean the correct one. I mean the yamin, the right side of the person. Okay? Again, for our purposes, although the example is crying out for explanation, I'm not going to get into an explanation of what is the symbol of that. But this is called matan bahonos. Matan bahonos. Bahonos just means, thumb and toe and earlobe. These appendages. And that is in addition. Now, the Torah then says, I'm sorry, that's all. Now, that's all it says by the Asham of a Mitzayra. So here's the question. Mitzayra was nichlal in every Asham, in Parshas Sav, right? If it just would have said Parshas Sav, I would have known every Asham, including Asham Mitzayra. But the Torah separated out Asham Mitzayra to give me a new mitzvah. And that new mitzvah is Matan Bahonos. So Mimela, the last klal says, now again, don't think about number 8 yet, because it's going to this will contradict number 8. It says, since Mitzayra was separated out to teach me an absolutely new mitzvah that doesn't apply to another Asham, I cannot apply the klal to an Asham Mitzayra, namely that you have Shtei Matana Shein Arba, and you have hektar chalavim on the Mizbeach, unless the Torah specifically tells me I could. Meaning the following. The way the Torah is set up is this. We have all the laws of Asham in Parshas Tzav. By Asham Mitzayra, the only thing that I'm told about is Bahonos. In other words, it doesn't tell me Zerika Sadam and hektar chalavim. So the question is, does an Asham Mitzayra have the regular Zerika Sadam? And does it have hektar chalavim on the Mizbeach? So just plugging in the words of the last klal, it says, Kol davar shahaya bichlal. An Asham Mitzayra was in the klal of all the Ashamis. Yatsa lidain. It came out separated to teach me a davar chadash, an absolutely new thing. What's the new thing? Bahonos. I ata yachel lachzirei lichlalei. With respect to everything else in the klal, which in this case would mean zerika sadam, shtei matana shein arba, and hektar chalavim, you cannot return Asham Mitzayra to the klal of the other Ashamis unless the Torah itself gives you permission to do that. Which means, therefore, that technically, standing alone, you'll see in a moment that Mitzayra happens to have permission. You'll see where we get that. Standing alone, I would have said, yeah, an Asham Mitzayra has Matan Bahonos, but there's no Zerika Sadam, and there's no hektar chalavim on the Mizbeach. And even though that's true for every other Asham, but Asham Mitzayra was excluded from other Ashamis, because it's Yatsa Lidain B'davar HaChadash. So how do I know, the Teres Kayanim asks, that Asham Mitzayra needs Zerikas Dam and hektar chalavim? Because there are superfluous words by Asham Mitzayra that say that the Asham Mitzayra is like all Ashamos. Those words appear in the Torah. And that is the part of the sentence, Ad shiachsirenu hakosov lichlalo befeirosh. What is the befeirosh? The statement that the Asham is a regular Asham too. Which means, this is a funny rule, because the example of the rule is an example of where you're not following. In other words, the rule actually says you wouldn't put it back into the klal unless the Torah returns it beferish. So your example is where the Torah did return it beferish. So actually, we don't have an example where I'm applying the klal of not returning it. But rather, we're reasoning this way. Since the Torah had to return it beferish, the Torah is teaching me, if it wouldn't have returned it beferish, you could not have returned it to the klal. Okay, complicated? Bottom line is relatively simple. Bottom line for this halacha, and that is, a Asham of a Mitzayra needs Shtei Matana Shein Arba, and it needs hektar chalavim. Right? Even though it's not beferish in the parsha of Mitzayra. Okay. So, this rule is telling me that when the Torah singles something out from a klal, you don't return it back to the general rule. And Rule 8 told me exactly the opposite. You do return it to the general rule. So when do you return it to the general rule? And when don't you return it to the general rule? So the operative concept is the difference in the wording. Klal 8 said you return it to the general rule if it's yotza min haklal lelamed. Klal 11 says you don't return it to the general rule. Yotza lidon badavar hachadash. So yotza min haklal lelamed is rule 8. Yotza lidon badavar hachadash is rule 11. Right? So now you have to know when is a singling out a davar hachadash, and when is it not a davar hachadash? So let's look at the examples of klal 8, because obviously the examples of klal 8, you're not applying klal 11. So let's ask why not. Klal 8, the Torah says, I'm going back to all of the examples I began with. The Torah says a machshefa is chayav misa. It doesn't say which misa. It then tells me oven yedoni is chayav skila. So there I say I return it to the klal. You'll ask me a kasha. Wait a second. If it's teaching me skila, that's a davar hachadash, something new. So I shouldn't be allowed to return it to the klal. Why isn't that davar chadash? So the Halichos Olam says that's not a davar hachadash, because even though it's telling me something new, that the punishment is skila, but since the klal already said there was a death penalty, that's not called chadash, because it's simply telling you which death penalty. So klal 11 doesn't apply, because it's not a chiddush within the meaning of klal 11. It's not a chiddush. I mean, it is, well, again, it is a chiddush, but it's not a chiddush within the meaning of klal 11, because you already knew from the klal there's a death penalty. This is just telling you which death penalty. Similarly, example number 2. The Torah says don't do work, and the Torah creates a separate lav for burning. Now, granted, that's teaching me a chiddush, but the statement is not a chiddush, because I already know there's an issur to light a fire. That's not a chiddush either. Example number 3, the Torah says if you eat kaidesh, you get kares. And then the Torah says if you eat shlamim, you get, and your tameh, you get kares. Again, it's not a chiddush, because it's telling me the same thing, even though it's teaching me a chiddush. But what it's stating is not a chiddush, because it doesn't contradict what the klal told me. Masha'ein kain by Mitzayra. That absolutely is a chiddush. Because in the regular case of an asham, the Torah says what you do with all the blood. You're zorek shtei matane shehin arba, and then you pour the rest of the blood on the base of the altar. By Mitzayra, the Torah is telling me something absolutely new. The absolutely new thing is that instead of dumping the rest of the blood on the foundation of the Mizbeach, part of the blood is placed on Bahonos. As a result, Klal 8 no longer applies. We now apply Klal 11. Klal 11 says it doesn't go back to the Klal unless the Torah tells you it goes back to the Klal, which in the case of Mitzayra, L'maisa, the Torah does tell you. Okay? So, I know complicated, but hopefully you'll understand, and you will also appreciate my great rachamim in not going over rules 9 and 10, which are really, those are really hard ones. I just want you to understand today, 8 and 11. Okay, 9 and 10, maybe we'll do a graduate course for that. Yeah.
Why aren't 8 and 11 like, one after the other, I guess?
Well, the reason is because 9 and 10 are also connected. I mean, 8, 9, 10, 11 are all connected to this issue. Davor sheyatsa min haklal. But 9 and 10 are extremely, extremely difficult. In fact, it's a funny thing. The Meforshim on the Yud Gimel Middos don't even give you a lot of examples of 9 and 10. They don't even illustrate it, so it's hard to figure out. Amir Hashem, if I could figure it out, maybe I'll share it with you. Right now, I'm having difficulty myself. But to know the difference between 8 and 11 is an important thing, because the Gemara does use both 8 and 11 different times. And once again, I'm going to warn you that when the Gemara uses it, it doesn't tell you it's using it. You're going to have to try to figure that out from the Mahalech of the Shakla V'Tarya. Okay, so then the last rules are relatively easy. Number 12 is actually 2 rules in one, but Davar halamed mi'inyano v'davar halamed misofo. They're counted as one, even though there are 2 statements. Davar halamed mi'inyano is really a very common sense rule. And that simply means that words are interpreted based on the overall context in which they appear. Right? Words can mean different things. Right? This is even true in English, any language. Right? A word means I have to look at the context. So here we have a very famous example. In the Aseres Hadibres, the Torah says, Lo tirtzach, right? Don't murder. Lo tinaf, don't commit adultery. Lo signov, do not steal. Now, so here's the question. If I rob you, I steal your wallet, am I over on the Isser in Lo signov? In other words, am I transgressing the 10 Commandments? Now, granted, there are clearly other prohibitions in the Torah on stealing, but I'm asking, am I over on the Lo signov in the Aseres Hadibres? Christians clearly say yes. They always say, anyone who steals is transgressing the 10 Commandments. Interestingly enough, and Rashi says this, we do not understand the Lo signov in the 10 Commandments to refer to money at all. Lo signov is a prohibition against kidnapping, stealing a person. Now again, that doesn't mean you're allowed to steal money. We have other lavin in the Torah about not stealing money, but the 10 Commandments is not one of them. Now the question is, why do you say that? If I read Lo signov in isolation, don't steal. That includes everything. Rashi says we apply the context, because Lo tirtzach and Lo tinaf, do not murder, do not commit adultery. These are capital crimes. These are things that if you do them and you're warned, you get the death penalty. So Mimela, if we're not sure what Lo signov includes, we understand Lo signov based on the context in which it appears. So just like murder and adultery are capital offenses, Lo signov has to be a capital offense. And we know from Parshas Mishpatim that if I steal money, I don't get the death penalty. I only have to pay double. But if I steal a person, if I kidnap a person, I can get the death penalty. So this is a perfect example. Davar halamed mi'inyano. You translate or interpret the words Lo signov based on the context in which it appears. That is how I know Lo signov is kidnapping rather than monetary theft. Again, this does not mean there's no lav to steal money. There are plenty of lavin, but they're in Parshas Kedoshim. In other words, the lav of the Aseres Hadibros is gonev nefashos. Yeah.
But lo ta'aneh and lo tachmod, it doesn't have the rule.
Yeah, that is a very good kasha. That is a very good kasha because davar halamed minyano is not being applied consistently. Because you are correct. Let's go in order here. So we have Lo tirtzach, Lo sinaf, Lo signov. Now, what about the next one? The next one, Lo sana b'reyacha eit shaker. Do not give false testimony in Beis Din. That potentially is a capital crime by Edom Zomimim. Not in every case. I mean, if I give false testimony in a monetary matter, I'm not going to get the death penalty. But as you know, if two Edom testify, Reuven killed Shimon on Monday in New York, and two other Edom say, how could you testify Reuven killed Shimon Monday in New York, Monday you were with us in Chicago. So the first witnesses are called what? Edom Zomimim, false witnesses. And what do you do to the witnesses? The Torah says you do to the witnesses what they wanted to do to the guy. They wanted to get the guy killed. So Mimela, even though they were not successful, they get killed. So at least Leisana in some applications will be a Chiyav Misa. So that's enough to allow it in there. Now, what's the next one? Leisachmaid is the next one, right? That's the last one. Leisachmaid is do not covet, do not be envious of someone. That's a little more difficult, although it does mention do not be envious of his wife. Perhaps that could come to Misa, but then of course, that would be duplicative of Lo Tinaf. So that is a good kasha. I have to think about it. But at least Leisana L'chalapachas is considered to be potentially a capital crime because of Edom Zaymimim. Right, so this is Davor Halamed Minyana. Again, it's a common sense idea that when words are ambiguous, you look at other words in the area where this is mentioned, and that gives you context, the context of words. Now, the next part of the sentence, because it's counted as one midah, is really just an extension. Davar halamed misofo, that sometimes the context will appear at the very end of a verse. An example would be the following. Again, the example is saras. Just as there is saras of a person, there is also saras on houses. Although the Gemara says perhaps such a thing never occurred, but there's saras on batim. And there's a ritual, a very detailed ritual the Torah gives you, which could culminate, if the saras doesn't get better, in actually having to physically destroy the house. And initially, the Torah simply talks about saras on a house, which could be any material, could be whatever it is, concrete or whatever. But then, as the Torah describes the process of dismantling, it mentions wood, stone, and mortar. So that's in the course of the story. So even though the initial statement of house could include a house of any material, metal for example, a metal house, but the end of the story indicates that we're only talking about a particular type of house, and that's a house of wood and or stone. So that's called davor. Halah made me, so sofa doesn't really mean the very end. Sofa just means the ongoing story may show you what the beginning was referring to. Okay, so this is not counted as two. Davar halamed mi and yano, davar halamed mi sofo are really the same midah, and that is you look at the overall picture to try to understand the meaning of a phrase. Yeah.
I know sometimes in the Gemara it talks about like there's like two psukim that are like samach to one another. Is this also using the same idea, or is it something different?
That's something different. That's really called a hekesh or smuchim. This is different. This is not so much a hekesh. This is simply looking at a narrative to define what we were talking about. Right? So that's contextual interpretation. Yeah.
With the house, it seems very similar to klal or prat.
Yep. Very excellent. That's a very, very good question. You could have analyzed it as klal uprat, and you would get the same result. Instead of calling it davar halamed misofo, it could be klal uprat, and then we would only apply it to the prat, which indeed is stone and wood, and or wood. Very good question. But the answer, once again, would be a similar answer to what I gave you before, that klal uprat is only when the Torah gives you a list. It says, the din applies to A, klal, then B, C, D. Here, the Torah gave you a klal, and then there's a narrative which brings in a prat. But you're correct. But in a way, it's a very good question, but you'll get the same result. So this is not a question that's going to change the result. It's just a different way of getting that result. Okay, so there's only one more midah left. We'll leave it for next time. And then perhaps I'm going to try to even do 9 and 10 if From courageous. Okay.